And now we're taking you live to the graphic business Stanbic breakfast meeting at the Labadi Beach Hotel. Please enjoy.
That has been touting lots of PPP projects. In fact, the first one I got to know of was the one that leads to my regional capital, Sekendi Takrade. It's been more than 10 years. That dualization has never happened. It was one of those projects. The question is, how do we make public-private partnerships a financing option for sustainable development? This morning we're tweaking things a little bit. We'd have one speaker, after which we'd have a conversation. You know, in the past we've had 3 or 4 speakers in a panel with questions posed to them. We're changing it a little bit, but of course I still remain your moderator, Winston Amwa. Thank you once again for joining us, and if we are meeting for the first time this year, Happy New Year to you, because we're still in January. And as we do, we'll start with an opening prayer. We'll invite Reverend Ken Okuson, who is Executive Chairman of CRIF. Let's welcome him as he gives us the opening prayer.
May I politely ask that we be upstanding? May I ask that we all, together with one accord, say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. I read to you from 1 Timothy 2, and it says, I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people. 34 million Ghanaians this morning, we pray for all Ghanaians. Ask God to help them. We ask God to help us this morning. We ask God to help 34 million Ghanaians. We ask God to help this country, Ghana. Intercede on their behalf. And this morning, together with one accord, we intercede on behalf of this country and give thanks for them. Pray this way for kings. We pray for the leadership of this country. We pray for His Excellency, the President, and all who are in authority, so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives, marked by godliness and dignity. This is good and pleases God our Savior. And all shall say, Amen.
Amen. I was looking at the faces of all those who could not recite the Lord's Prayer. Anyway, so we'll move on and we'll invite Asamoah Boahene, who is editor of Graphic Business, to give us the welcome address. Let's welcome him.
Good morning and welcome. And I also wish to extend the gratitude of the management and board of Graphic Communications Group, and to wish you a Happy New Year. So once again, on behalf of the Managing Director of Stanbic Bank, Graphic MD, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our first quarter event for the year. As we gather here today, we are filled with a sense of optimism, cautious as it may. Businesses are eager to explore the prospects of a new government, and we are no exception. While some may say hope is not a strategy, we believe that by providing a platform for business leaders to discuss and debate, we can turn hope into actionable plans. For over 70 years, we have been committed to publishing credible news that informs and empower our readers. Our platforms, including the Graphic Business Stanbic Bank Breakfast Meeting, are designed to deepen the conversations we have in our daily lives, around the dining table, on the golf courses, and in the boardroom. Our goal is to crystallize these discussions and amplify our voices in the national discourse. We are proud to say that our efforts have yielded some tangible results including the Investor Protection Plan or the Investor Protection Bill, which is currently at the nascent stages. This achievement is a testament to the power of collaboration and the impact we have when we come together to solve national interests. As we begin this new year, we reiterate our commitment to creating opportunities for business leaders to converge and find solutions to our common national problems. We are grateful for our partnership with Stanbic Bank, which enables us to host these meaningful events. And of course, to Multimedia Group for also supporting us. Once again, welcome, and I wish you a happy new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asamoah Boahene, who is editor of Graphic Business. Which means we can introduce our guest speaker for today for his presentation. And our guest speaker is a top management executive with over 25 years of professional experience in assisting businesses and governments to navigate the complex field of transactions, including due diligence work, investment appraisals, and business valuations. His professional services have also covered advice to both selling and buying parties on transactions across a variety of industries such as banking and financial services. He is the country senior partner at PwC Ghana. Let's welcome Vish Ashagbo.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be here. Good morning to, I know there's a group of people watching us or following us online and on radio, so good morning to everybody. And thank you to Graphic and Stanbic for inviting me to give this short presentation on PPPs and how they can enable, or whether they can enable sustainable development. And I noted the point you just made about having heard about PPPs for a while, but we believe as PwC, based on the work that we've done right here in Ghana and other parts of the world, that indeed PPPs are a good and sustainable source of financing for development. And I have a few slides that I'd like to use in my presentation. So I don't know if the logistics team can help me put those slides up. I have about, I believe, about half an hour or so of presentation time, and then we can get into discussions, and I think that's the more important part. So please feel free to ask questions or make comments as you wish. So let me see if this works. Yeah. Okay, so I've set out my presentation in these few sections, which I think will help the conversation. Essentially, we are focused today on sustainable development with emphasis on the word sustainable. So I will start off by essentially defining what sustainable development entails. It may seem obvious, but I think it's good for us all to be on the same page. What do we mean by sustainable development? Then public-private partnerships. What constitutes a public-private partnership? Again, Winston mentioned that he had been hearing of this for well over 10 years. In actual fact, work has been going on PPPs here in Ghana. Even before that, certainly we have been involved in PPPs as far back as 2008. At that time, we didn't have the legal framework for PPPs, but fortunately today we do. So we have an act of parliament passed in 2020, which sets out essentially what a PPP is and what the characteristics of PPP are and the type of things we should be seeking to achieve in a public-private partnership. So I'll basically touch on some of that again, just as context. Then I will give some case studies. PPPs are quite complex projects. I'm sure a lot of people in the room will be quick to point to PPPs that either have not worked or have not taken off or have stalled, whatever the people's experience has been. But in actual fact, if you get them right, they can and are very beneficial. So I'm going to just quickly run through a couple of case studies. I have two case studies of what I call success stories, and two case studies, very brief case studies, not detailed, high-level case studies that where the projects were not entirely successful. And then I'll conclude with what we are aware of from public domain information as to the PPP projects that are currently under consideration and tie it back to sustainable development and financing. Then, of course, please feel free to ask questions and comment when the floor is opened. So sustainable development. What do we actually mean by sustainable development? Okay, if somebody can help me move the slide. The clicker seems to be stuck. Okay, so I've chosen to use a definition from the former Secretary General of the OECD. And for the benefit of those who are listening but cannot see the slide, I'll just read it very quickly. So sustainable development requires that the costs of today's projects do not translate into liabilities for tomorrow. Both public and private sectors need to make long-term investments in infrastructure and social systems that will benefit future generations. Private enterprises must see this not just as a responsibility, but as an opportunity for sustainable growth. So we quite like this definition of sustainable development because it has all the elements that we as a developing nation are looking for and we constantly debate and argue over. So some key terms there, projects that do not translate into liabilities for tomorrow. That's important. Both public and private sectors need to make long-term investments. So already you can see that there's a connection between public and private. And then it ends by saying private enterprises must see this not just as a responsibility, but an opportunity for sustainable growth. And at the end of the day, what we're looking for as a developing country, or indeed any country in the world, is looking for sustainable growth. So that's the definition I'd like to use this morning in terms of sustainable development. So back to the topic, how do PPPs, or how can we use PPPs, let me use the word enabler, as enabler for sustainable development as defined by the OECD in this case. So when we refer to sustainable development, what are the underlying sectors that support that? And again, this is basically our own assessment as PwC, and we look from the bottom of the chart up, and for the benefit of those who are listening in rather than watching us, I'll just read it out quickly. So in order to drive sustainable development in any economy, you must have energy, you must have industry, agric and industry, you must have transportation networks and transportation systems. ICT today is a significant, in fact, today you can't do without ICT if you are to have sustainable development. Then the basics of life, water and sanitation, health and education, and housing. So for us, when we talk about sustainable development and trying to finance sustainable development, these are the sectors that we would be referring to. Now, you may have one or two others, but this is how we have categorized them. And then we go further to categorize them between what we refer to as more commercial leaning and more social leaning. And let me explain that very quickly. So when we say more commercial leaning, if you look at energy, you look at industry, you look at transport, and you look at ICT, those sectors, by the nature of the services and infrastructure that those sectors require, are lean more towards commercialization than, let's say, water, health, education, and housing. That does not mean you cannot have commercial elements in these other three, but certainly it's simpler, easier, more attractive to a commercial party to be on the left-hand side of this chart, which is energy, agric and industry, transport, ICT, than water, housing, education, and housing. Because obviously those are social projects and issues around affordability and ability to pay, et cetera, need to be carefully considered and carefully assessed. These are the underlying elements that we believe drive sustainable development. But at the same time, we also believe strongly that all of these sectors can benefit from PPP financing. And I'm emphasizing financing, but I must also make the point that when you talk about PPPs, it's not necessarily all about financing. There are other elements that go into a PPP, again, which I'll touch on in the course of our discussion. Okay, so because we are focused on financing, and I think in his opening remarks, Winston did a good job on summarizing where we are as a country in terms of our financial challenges. So here we are seeking sustainable development. Here we are seeking to drive investment in those sectors that I just spoke about, in housing, in education, in water and sanitation, in energy, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we are constrained because we have a budgetary difficulty, and today we are out of the capital markets. So typically, how does government finance public infrastructure or public services? There's a number of ways government can do it and has done it over the years. So domestic revenue sources, that's basically the budget. So government can finance things using the budget. It can raise debt, Eurobonds, etc. That's the sovereign debt piece. It can use grant income from development partners, for example. Commercial debt, the banks and other financial institutions could provide money to government to drive development. Private sector, sometimes private sector steps in, and it could be direct financing from private sector, and I'm kind of distinguishing that from, say, a bank, which is also private sector anyway. Then DFIs, development finance institutions. DFIs, as some of you or many of you in the room or many of you listening may know, are specialized in the sense that they are providing finance for what qualifies, if I can put it that way, as a development project as opposed to, let's say, a commercial project or a full profit making project. So a DFI would typically be looking to finance those social projects that I mentioned, things like water and sanitation, housing, education, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a potential source of financing. And in recent times, we have green financing that has opened up. And as the name suggests, if a project by its features or its benefits and outcomes can demonstrate that it speaks to the ESG agenda, there could potentially be green finance that will be available. When we talk about public-private partnerships or financing from public-private partnerships, it's not necessarily from a single source. It could be from a combination of all of this. So you can potentially have a project that has some government money in it, it has some DFI money in it, and then it has some commercial lender money in it, all in the same project. And each plays a different role. But the overall objective of having that mix of financing is to make the project work so that overall the benefits are realized. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Okay, can you help me with the slide, please? Okay, so sustainable development, back to sustainable development, and how do we assess whether we've actually achieved sustainable development or not? And here are just a few thoughts. So because we are, if you remember the definition I started off with about spanning a long period of time, et cetera, and generations, et cetera, the useful life of the asset must span more than one generation, so that it's not like a flash in the pan. We did a project, and then within 1-2 years, the benefits are realized, and then that's not sustainable. We want something that spans generations. Same thing for services, so I'll skip the second point. Then the final point we have here is that the total costs and benefits must be distributed equitably across the generations. So again, back to the definition of sustainable development, you don't want a project where one generation benefits from it, only to leave liabilities for future generations, which I think is part of the problem we've had in our country over history. Okay, I think I'm going to have to rely on, yes. So let me get into public-private partnerships and what makes it a viable financing option. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to start with the definition of a PPP, of a public-private partnership, because again, there have been different views as to what constitutes a PPP and what is not a PPP, et cetera, et cetera. So fortunately for us, in 2020, the PPP Act was passed by Parliament, Act 1039, and that gives us a very clear definition of what a PPP is. So again, for the benefit of those who are listening as opposed to watching, I will read it out. It says, public-private partnership means a form of contractual arrangement or concession between a contracting authority and a private party for the provision of public infrastructure or public services traditionally provided by the public sector, as a result of which the private party performs part or all of the infrastructure or service delivery functions of government and assumes the defined risks over a significant period of time. So it's quite a mouthful, but there's some key words and phrases there again that I'll just draw your attention to. So it's a contractual arrangement, so it's a contract. It's between a contracting authority, and when the Act says contracting authority, typically it's referring to a government authority of some kind. It could be, just as an example, Ports and Harbors Authority. It could be Ghana Highways Authority, for example. So that would be those would be examples of contracting authorities for the provision of public infrastructure or public services. So public infrastructure, for example, roads, for example, water, for example, schools, right? Those are typically public sector or government responsibilities. But in a PPP, a private party can provide those services. They perform part or all of the infrastructure or service delivery functions for the government, and they assumed defined risk over a period of time. So PPP is quite different from just providing financing for a project. You must assume some risks. And of course, you are also remunerated in according to performance in line with the risk that you've assumed. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, this is just a definition by the World Bank. Obviously, we have our own act, so that's the definition that we work with. But just to give another context, the World Bank defines it also as a contract between a private party and a government entity for providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risks and management responsibility, and remuneration is linked to performance. That is very important. Remuneration is linked to performance. That is one of the key elements of a PPP. So you don't just get paid for providing an asset or providing a service and walking away, but your remuneration as the private party is linked to performance as defined by the contractual arrangements. The other thing I'd like to draw attention to is that typically when we think about PPPs, we think infrastructure, but PPPs can also apply in services. Right? And again, in one of the case studies that I'll show you shortly, it's a service-related PPP, but obviously you need the infrastructure to deliver the service. So typically the private sector brings the infrastructure and then they go on to provide the service as part of the PPP arrangement. So if I can move to the next slide, please. These are just some examples of, well, let me say that this is a spectrum of, let me call it private sector participation and what typically would qualify as a PPP. So when we talk about private sector participation, obviously government works in partnership with the private sector in different forms. But then there's a scale that goes from the private sector's perspective from very low risk or relatively low risk to quite high risk. So on the far left hand of the chart, and again for the benefit of those who are listening, I'll just read it out. If you have a service contract, if you've been contracted by government to provide a service, that is not a PPP, because you just deliver the service, then you get paid. You're not assuming any risk. Yes, you may have some KPIs in the contract based on which you're paid, but there's no risk, and you are not assuming or you're not delivering a public service on behalf of the government. So that wouldn't typically be a PPP. But then you get into a management contract or a lease or a concession or a partial divestiture, then you're beginning to get into the realm, well, you are actually in the realm of a PPP, because then there are some risks that you're beginning to assume, there are some responsibilities that you're taking on, and then your own remuneration or compensation will be tied to some delivery around this. So specific examples, if you think about management contracts, many years ago, we had a management contract in Ghana Water Company, for example. So some of you who are old enough may remember. So management contracts have been used. Lease arrangements. I think that the arrangement that government tried to enter into with respect to ECG was essentially a lease agreement. And then, of course, we have concessions and BOTs, build, operate, transfer. BOT stands for build, operate, transfer. DBO stands for design, build, and operate. So that's what the private sector would be doing. And then partial divestiture, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the far right, which we would not consider to be a PPP, is where assets have been fully divested to the private sector, because obviously at that point, it's a fully private sector endeavor. So as you move along the scale from the left-hand side of the chart to the right, from a private sector point of view, you're assuming more risk because you have more skin in the game, if I can use that terminology. And that is why PPPs, basically they fall within a range, and we just need to be clear on which particular aspect we are referring to when we talk about PPP. So we can move to the next slide. So what is the business case for PPP as a suitable route for sustainable development? We've already spoken about the challenges that government has from a financing point of view. So we, as a developing country, we have significant demands for infrastructure and public services. But at the same time, we are financially constrained. Therefore, it makes sense for us to explore whatever avenues are available to us in terms of how we bridge that financing gap. And obviously, PPPs offers such opportunity. I said before that PPP is not necessarily all about financing. There's efficiencies, there's innovation, there's other things that the private sector, working in partnership with government, can bring to infrastructure projects and can bring to the delivery of public services. So that's also another benefit that PPPs can bring and can help us along the journey for sustainable development. So in our view, PwC's view, a well-structured and executed and enforced PPP can help in the journey towards sustainable development. But we must have appropriate risk sharing. I'll talk a little bit about that. We must have the right expertise and experience. And then we must have a framework or an environment that allows us to harness the private sector skills and efficiency. And I think largely we do. Yes, we have some macroeconomic challenges, but all things considered, I think we do have that framework. It's about converting it into actual projects and services. So we can move on to the next slide. I think I've already touched on some of this, but let me pick on a few things here, because as I said, the PPP is not just about financing. In essence, it's about value for money, right? It's about value for money. And value for money is on different measures. It's not all about financing. So value for money, I don't know whether you can see the footnote at the bottom of the slide, but value for money means that over the whole life of the project, government's total expenditures, that is payments to the private sector, adjusted for the risks that have been transferred to the private sector, should be less on a net present value basis than if government had performed the services itself. In simple terms, if the private sector is to partner with government to deliver a project or or let me put it differently. If the private sector is to partner with government to deliver a public asset or to deliver public services, the only reason it would make sense if there's value for money. In other words, the involvement of the private sector is such that the overall cost to government is lower than if government had done it itself. Otherwise, government should just go ahead and do it, right? So that is the fundamental thinking behind PPP projects. As I said, it's not all about financing. So for a PPP project, no matter what type of project it is, whether it's an airport, whether it's a seaport, whether it's a railway line, the issue is not so much about the asset itself, but about the service. So when government is engaging in a PPP project, partnering with the private sector, including financing, government will be looking at the service that that asset will deliver to the public. It's not, because otherwise you just go and buy or finance the construction of an airport terminal and leave. But you're looking at the service that goes along with it. So government will specify the outputs. In other words, I want a terminal of this size that is capable of, or that has facilities A, B, C, D, E, that has a certain maintenance regime, et cetera, et cetera. There's different sorts of things that government will specify over and beyond the construction of the asset itself. The private sector typically will provide the design, the technology, the construction, the financing, the operations and management. Again, because in most situations, not all, in most situations, the private sector can deliver these things more efficiently than the public sector. It's not always the case, but these are some of the assessments that need to be made. And then the private sector, risks are allocated. So it's a partnership, public-private partnership. So risks are allocated. One party will bear financing risks, one party will bear design risks, regulation, so many different types of risks one could think of. But the risks are allocated between the parties, including demand risk, et cetera, et cetera. And then the private sector is paid according to what it delivers. So let's move on. I've already touched on this, but the benefits of PPPs, access to private capital, risk sharing, innovation efficiency, in principle, not always the case, but in principle, faster project delivery, because the contracting parties would have agreed a timeline, and the private party typically would be remunerated based on attainment of those timelines, et cetera, et cetera. Enhanced accountability, and then private sector capability, in the sense that private sector capability is brought into the delivery of public services and the construction of public infrastructure. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, what are the critical success factors that a PPP project requires? How do we actually unlock these benefits? I hope so far I've been able to demonstrate to you that PPPs in concept can align and do align with what we try to achieve in the area of sustainable development. But there are some critical success factors, because I'm sure in the room, maybe when we open it up of Q&A, everybody will have an experience or an example of some PPP that they heard of that never saw the light of day, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at some of the critical success factors for PPP projects. Project necessity, it seems obvious, but there must be a need, right? There must be a need for the project, there must be a need for the service. That's number one. So provide essential services. Projects must address critical infrastructure needs. If there's no need, there's no project, so that's obvious. But you must actually have a pretty rigorous, thorough, and realistic assessment of the project, because we have seen projects run into trouble because the assessment was not done properly right from the get-go. This is critically important, as is the third point, project viability and cash flow, because you are partnering with the private sector. And private sector, private business people I was going to say one motive, but that's not true. They are principally driven by the profit motive. I mean, we're all also interested in societal impact and all of that, but cash is king, right? So when you're talking to the private sector, they are looking for project viability and cash flow as one of their prerequisites. And the way you can assure yourself as much as you can, because it's never 100%, is to do a thorough and realistic assessment of the project. Then you must have appropriate risk sharing. And this is a point that is often misunderstood, because when we talk about PPPs, a lot of people think it's about the private sector bringing money and then the project goes ahead. But there are different elements in there. So for example, if you think about a project, a road project, private sector, in principle, could come and build a road. For example, the private sector could come and upgrade the Accra-Tema motorway, right? But if private sector is to get its return from the project, then somebody has to bear the risk of traffic either not meeting the anticipated level or some other problem crops up that makes the revenues dip. So those are the type of things we're referring to when we talk about risk allocation. In this particular example, that's an example of the demand risk that would need to be managed. So we can move to the next slide. Some of the, I'll use the word softer. They're not soft issues, but traditionally we have focused on the points that I referred to in the earlier slide, sometimes at the expense of these other points, which are also critically important for a successful PPP. So you need a capable private partner. It's a partnership. The idea is that the private sector is stepping in to provide public infrastructure that the government otherwise would have done. The private sector is stepping in to provide a public service that a government agency would otherwise have done. So you must have a capable private partner. Otherwise, the whole principle of a PPP falls apart. And unfortunately, we have seen projects where the private partner has not been able to deliver, and then the project runs into trouble. Government commitment and support is critical. And when I say government commitment and support, it could be from a financing perspective, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be from a regulatory perspective. It could just be from, as the chart shows over there, ensuring that timely approvals are received and that processes move as quickly as possible so that the project can be delivered or the service can be provided efficiently. But it's a partnership between government and the private sector, and the government commitment is indispensable. Otherwise, again, there are problems. Debt guarantees, yes and maybe no. Typically, there are debt guarantees because, again, if you refer back to what I said earlier about the financing streams, you may have commercial lenders as part of your consortium. Even if you don't, you may have development finance institutions or private parties as part of your financing arrangement. Some of those, in fact, most of those, will probably require some kind of comfort so that they make sure that they get their money back. And it sometimes falls on government to provide those guarantees to make the project come together. It all depends on how the project has been structured and how viable the project is, et cetera, et cetera. But most importantly is shared authority, trust, and communication. It's a contract. And as business people, we know that even outside the complications of a PPP, if you're in a business contractual relationship, trust, communication, and shared authority is critical for the project to work, and it's no different in the context of a PPP. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So the PPP Law Act 1039 provides, let me say must-haves. These are extracted from the law. In fact, everything I'm presenting today is from publicly available information. So if you are interested, you can reference those things yourselves, or we can have a discussion about that. But the PPP Act says that PPP arrangements must deliver value for money. I think I've already explained that. So I'll move on to effective risk allocation, which essentially I've also touched on. effective risk allocation, the word there, or the key word there is effective. Because again, sometimes people refer to or think that PPP means that the private sector must do everything. So you've got a private partner with government, so now it's the private sector's responsibility. No, there are some things that the government can do better than the private sector. And actually there are some things that government can do. For example, giving you a license, right? And so those are some of the things that a PPP would be looking for government to do. Affordability and long-term government budgetary sustainability. So the project must be affordable. And affordability is in a number of different contexts. If the project is what we call a user paid project, in other words, for example, a toll road, where those who use the road are going to pay tolls, is the toll affordable, right? Or if government is putting in some money to make the project affordable or just to support the project generally, is what government being asked to put into the project sustainable? So those are some of the things that the Act requires that we look at. It also says we must maximize the use of local content and foster technology transfer so that we promote local industries and the private sector in Ghana. You know, when we talk about PPPs, most people think automatically about foreign investors. Not necessarily. PPPs can happen within the local economy, and I think this is one of the very good provisions that drive us more towards local participation in some of those things. And it must have a possible impact on the public trust. Safeguarding vulnerable groups, setting affordable user charges and tariffs, and then also environmental considerations. So we must, or PPP projects must conform to Ghana's environmental laws and adhere to the highest standards. So all these boxes have to be ticked in order for a project to qualify as a PPP under the Act that we have here in Ghana. We can move to the next slide. So, I think I've downloaded a lot of information, and I know bits of it may still be moving around in people's minds, but I thought I could give some examples of PPP projects and what has made them successful as against other projects that have yet to achieve success, okay? So I have 4 case studies, 2 of success and 2 that are still in the works towards success. And I have 2 from right here in Ghana in the transport sector. I think my examples are from the transport sector and another sector. So let's get into it. If I can go on to the next slide. Okay, so this we all know. We all know about this project. As to whether we look at it as a PPP, is maybe what it is a PPP. This is the National Identification System project, essentially the Ghana card, which today I think we cannot do much without. So this is a PPP project. Private company Identity Management Systems Limited. It's a design, build, operate, and transfer project, and it was closed in 2017. Right. So the issue of national ID cards is obviously a government function, right? But in this case, we have a private party that is, or that has invested in the equipment, the infrastructure that is required to produce the Ghana card and is issuing it on behalf of the National Identification Authority. So it's a project that has come together as a partnership. And as I said before, it's a design, build, operate, and transfer. What has made it successful? I'll just pick on 2, maybe 3 things. And I'll go to on the right-hand side of the slide, where it refers to project viability and cash flow. And by the way, as I said before, this information is from publicly available sources. So this is from a report that the NIA gave to Parliament in February 2023. So if you're interested, you can take your time to research it and read more about it. But essentially, the project is viable because of the cash flows that it delivers. There's enough money to pay the bills, essentially, and to cover the cost of the financing, as it says there, to pay off the debt and to give the private sector the return that they are looking for the risk that they've assumed. Now, how was that made possible? It was made possible by point number 4 on my slide, which refers to government commitment and support. Now, in this particular project, and I stand to be corrected, I'm not sure government actually put in money, or even if they did, it was mostly private sector money. But government commitment and support came through legislation and regulation. So if government says you must have a Ghana card, and I've contracted with party A to provide the Ghana cards, well, I guess it's a market that is basically solely for this particular partnership. But it's serving a public good, right? It's providing a public service. And so today, of course, there was also a guarantee for the project, a financing guarantee. But of course, guarantees are backstops. As I said before, depending on the financing mix for the project, it may or may not be required. But here's an example of a PPP that has worked. I'll leave this one. I'll go to the next one, but we can come back to the examples maybe once I've done. I've then gone to South Africa to look at a rail project, the How Train. Now, if you've been to South Africa, you may have used the rapid transit from the international airport into Sandton, the How Train. Now, the How Train is a PPP project which came about. In fact, the need for that project came through the 2010 World Cup, when they were considering how to move large volumes of people from the airport into town without congesting the roads and creating safety issues, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the How Train had its challenges. And in actual fact, a lot of PPPs do have challenges, but the issue is that you can actually work them out just like any other contractual relationship. So How Train is another successful PPP project. Design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. So the private party designed, they built, they are operating, and they are maintaining the service. And I'm emphasizing the service. Yes, infrastructure, the railway line, rolling stock, etc., but it's about the service, right? And that is ongoing. Again, what made this successful? Clear allocation of roles and risks. So it was clear. Public authority, you do this. Private party, you do that. And so far as everybody is doing their part, we can achieve success. As I said, it was a bit shaky from the beginning, but I think they got there in the end. Clear KPIs have been set and enforced as the basis for private sector remuneration. So the private sector that is operating the service has to meet certain performance indicators based on which they are remunerated. So they cannot go to sleep and not deliver on their part of the bargain. Because if they do so, then the public authority then has the right to either withhold or to penalize whatever the contractual arrangement requires. Again, for this project, there was government commitment and support. And one of the points perhaps I've not made very clear so far is that even where we refer to financing using a PPP, it need not necessarily be 100% financing from the private sector. It may be that the project needs 200. Government only has 100. So private sector can bring in the 100. So it can be partial. In the case of How Train, it was actually largely financed by government. They put in $3 billion equivalent, and then the private sector raised the rest of the financing to complete the project. But then by virtue of the fact that it's being operated and maintained by the private sector, the efficiencies and the demand for the service has ensured that there's been sufficient cash flows so that the stakeholders can be paid. As I said before, a PPP project is not about the asset itself, it's about the service. And the private parties in the consortium, and in this case, even the government itself, I think has realized significant benefits and returns from that PPP arrangement. So these are two case studies that show how PPPs can work if successfully structured. I'd like to go to two other examples that are let me put it differently. We're still getting there. Okay, so this project, the desalination plant, I don't know, some of you may have read about it. It's a difficult one, and I think that we're still trying to get it right. So this is a water desalination plant somewhere in Teshinungwa. It's a build, own, operate, and transfer. I think it's fair to say that it has run into difficulties. It seems, and I'm not 100% sure because all I have is publicly available information, it seems that perhaps the initial assessments that were done need to be redone, and some fine-tuning needs to be done to make the project come to fruition. But the idea was essentially to provide water to the community. As I said before, it's an example of a social project. But I think all being said, the tariffs, the cost, the unit cost of the water was just too high. And affordability became an issue. And therefore, obviously, the project has not progressed to the satisfaction of either party or to the community. So here's an example of a project that hasn't quite worked, whether it's the initial assessment or whether it's the project risks that have not been properly allocated. I think this is one where some reworking is ongoing or needs to be done to turn it into a success story. And like I said, even How Train, which I'm saying is a success story, did have to have some fine-tuning along the way to make it successful. Then my final example is another transport project. This is in the UK, from the London Underground, where this is quite old now. Back in 2003, London Underground tried to expand its network with a private partner, and the risk allocation just didn't work. The private party was not sufficiently equipped to deliver the project, and therefore the project did not take off. Project assessment, back to project assessment, was insufficient. It wasn't thorough or as thorough as it ought to have been. It wasn't realistic. Eventually, the PPP did not work, and the project had to revert into public hands. So this is a very quick run through. There's many, many, many examples of projects that have worked and those that have not. But it is possible. It is possible to use PPPs as a financing option for development, as I hope at least some of the examples or two of the examples that I've shown you have indicated. So let's move to the next slide. I'll try and finish this up so we can open it up for discussion. So how do we make it a viable financing option here in Ghana? We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to say that based on what's available in the public domain, and this is 2023 data, which is the latest we can find, but there's a number of PPP projects still being worked in the pipeline. If we can go on to the next slide, it will give you a view as to what type of projects government is looking at. So you can see a wide range of projects here. You can see a sports terminal, a bus terminal, Accra-Tema motorway expansion. Maybe let's go to the next slide. You can see railway lines. I mean, different projects of different sizes. So there's a number of projects that are in the works. One thing about PPP projects is that they do take time to put together, again, because of all the different moving parts that one has to think about. But this is clearly an opportunity, or there is clearly an opportunity for us to use PPPs as a financing channel for development projects. Complicated, yes. Success stories limited at this point, but the opportunity remains, as we've seen from some case studies and as we see in other parts of the world. We can move on to the next slide. I think I've already said this. Some of the lessons for us here in Ghana is that they are complex and time-consuming to put together. But it is better to spend the time to get it right up front than to have a situation on your hands where you have to rework the whole project, or where we are not getting the benefits that we desire from the project towards our sustainable development. PPP projects need to be aligned with our long-term goals as a country for sustainability and value for money. And I think, as I've already said, they are long-term commitments, commercial relationships between the public and the private sector. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide. For us at PwC, we've been working on PPPs. We've studied PPP projects in different parts of the world through our global network. We've been fortunate enough to have worked with the Ministry of Finance and other government agencies to assess PPP projects in Ghana. And we firmly believe that it is indeed a viable financing option. It's not that straightforward. So it's not like going to the bank, borrowing money, and off you go. There are different considerations, but it can work. It can work, and when it works, the benefits are quite significant for the economy. So where we are today as a country, where we have a significant deficit in terms of infrastructure, and in fact public services, not just public infrastructure, but public services as well, we believe that PPPs do offer a way out, not just in terms of the financing, but in terms of the broader benefits of efficiency, innovation, etc. But we also don't underplay the fact that it requires careful analysis, careful study. The most important thing for us that we always say is that we need to look at it as a partnership. The public authority, the government must do its part, but so must the private sector. Too often we've seen projects where either government has not done its part, what it's supposed to do, and therefore the project is stuck. But then for us in the private sector as well, we also see examples where we have also not delivered on our promise. So in order for this to work, both parties must do their part. But we firmly believe that PPPs actually do offer a channel of financing for development. It just needs to be carefully aligned to the specific project, the specific service, and what our long-term objectives are. So I think that's my last slide. If you can move to the next slide, let me just check. Yes, so I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that's been informative, and I look forward to whatever questions or comments that you have for me. Thank you.
We can definitely do better. Senior Country Partner, PwC, Vish Ashiagbo. And, ending and talking about the fact that both the public and the private have roles to play, and we must ensure that those roles are played, in effect, the responsibilities. We are fortunate because we have the Chief Director of the Ministry of Finance here. We also have a representative from Margins Group. You heard the story about the Ghana card, something that we are all proud of today. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'll take brief comments from Cynthia Arthur from the Ministry of Finance, then I'll get to Sylvia from the Margins Group, and then we'll open it all up. So let's get a microphone to them. If there's a microphone already, yes. Cynthia Arthur is here. Please, let's get a microphone to her.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Hello. So I'm at Public and Assets Division.
Sure. Thank you.
But it's good to know that you can see into the future. So thank you very much. I think that is a very good presentation. I think it's a good presentation, which touched on all the things I would have said if I was the one doing the presentation. And I also like the fact that you emphasized key success factors that sometimes is misconstrued by the private sector as to what the role of government is, and vice versa, because there are fiscal challenges, as was said in the MC's introduction. Government is actually looking towards getting the private sector, if possible, to take off all the financial responsibilities that comes up with delivering infrastructure and public services in the country. But the role of both parties is actually key. Once we understand that, and I like the fact that you mentioned shared authority, trust, and communication. Because it's a long-term contractual agreement, it's important that both parties understand their rights and obligations under the contract. And this comes with continuous engagements and communication in terms of the KPIs, what our understandings are, and also fostering some basic understanding in terms of obligations and delivering of the KPIs. The capability of the private sector is key. We are in a stage where, as a country, private sector is still building capacity. So over the years, we have relied on foreign participants in our development efforts. But gradually, we have seen the Ghanaian private sector coming on board. I can say that there are some contractors who are also leading. Dakar Motorway, for instance, has a heavy local content there. And if you see the fact that GIF, which is seen as the government rep in this engagement, is supporting this to happen, it's something that we think that, given the government commitment, as you have again mentioned, we can have a lot more PPPs coming into being. But I also want to add other factors that I see from where I sit. Appraisal is key. It requires patience. We are used to EPC type of contracts where government will give a contractor a contract to deliver a public good, road, schools, or whatever infrastructure. And so it's quick. We are used to that. But with PPPs, it's not like that. We have to make sure that we have the necessary demand factors, sources of revenue, and even regulated by fees and charges, because it's a public service. The fees, and again, you mentioned affordability. And so it's important that the public is able to afford in terms of the fees and charges, which also comes with regulations. And so that is also there. And in terms of government commitment, again, in terms of policy, we are all aware about the tolls that were taken off, I think 2 years ago or so. We are thinking of bringing it back. And I'm happy that the public, most of the Ghanaian public, are happy about the tolls coming back, because we have seen the effects of it being taken off. And the fact that once it comes back, we are able to improve and support PPP, because without fees and the willingness of the public to pay for these services, PPPs may not happen. And so there's also the need for the willingness of the public to pay for these services. And then I also saw the value for money, as you mentioned. In fact, we at the Ministry of Finance are not only looking for value for money, which is key, but we're also looking for value for people. You mentioned about the fact that it's important that there is need for the infrastructure. If there's no need for the infrastructure, it affects the demand, the numbers, cash flow for the project to be viable. And therefore, it's important that, apart from the demand, prices or fees is also key in determining a viable project. And so for us, value for money is key. It must be cheaper for governments to allow the private sector to do it as you explained it. But also, whatever service we are delivering must be of the right quality, and people must be happy to pay for the service to make the PPP work. So with these few remarks, I'm happy about your presentation, and thank you very much. We are happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, which means we can hear from Sylvia from the Margins Group.
Thank you very much, sir, for the good presentation. I'm Sylvia Boatma-Asare, and I'm the Acting Chief Operating Officer for Identity Management Systems. Identity Management System is a subsidiary of the Margins ID Group, which is a bigger company that is involved in providing IT solutions and identity solutions globally. The Ghana card is one of our projects, a success as well. So if you look at the things that we have learned from the project, I think the speaker has been very well in presenting what the project is about, so I will not delve into that. But I will touch on some of the issues and things that we dealt with to have this success story. So we had a clear legal framework. So if you look at one of the successes that make a PPP very successful, is having a very good framework, a legal framework, and also we deployed a high level of risk assessment and management. So we made sure that we had our risk profile in place and how we would deal with this risk. So this was one of the key things that helped us. And then the next one will be efficiency and expertise. We brought to the table a lot of efficiency and expertise, and we ensured that we were delivering value to Ghana and to Ghanaians as well. And you can see that in how the usage of the card has become very important in many of our society services that we are providing, i.e. banking services, GRA, and most of the things that we do. So in conclusion, mobilization of resource was also a key success factor of the project. So we worked with banks and supply companies to ensure that we deliver value to Ghana. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. We also have DCOP Ben Oseadai here. DCOP, you want to make some brief remarks before we move on? Yes, please get a microphone to DCOP.
Well, for me in the security service, all this money issue is quite germane to me. But I am happy to be here to represent the Inspector General of Police and also know what goes on here. And in fact, some of the things I am experiencing or I am seeing here, I didn't know about it. That, for example, what the main speaker, Mr. Vish Ashagbo, talked about, that the Ghana Card project, this whole Ghana Card project is a PPP. It's quite new to me. I didn't know anything about it. So I'm here more to observe and take the good things I will learn from here back to the police headquarters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DCOP Ben Ade, which means we are open for questions now and comments. Just show by hand. We'll get a microphone to you. And okay, I see one at the back. I see two hands at the back. Okay, yes, first. Then we go to the second one at the back. You tell us your name, the institution you're coming from, and then you go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Amponsa Boatin. I'm with PKF. In fact, I've known Vish for a very long time because we're in the same industry. When he began to speak, it was like, oh, he's the finance minister, and maybe that would have been his deputy. Now, you see, we must know that at the moment we are under IMF, and we are looking at financing. Okay, some banks have gone down, okay, in the past. So I'm just imagining how the private sector will be able to be a support to the government. One issue which is dear to my heart is the debt to equity ratio, okay, which you know has an effect on those who want to do that. I wouldn't say a favor to the government. Now, we are also saying that we want the PPPs to benefit generations. You didn't give us maybe the number of years, but I can tell you that if you're not careful, the next generation, due to how we are managing the resources that we are going to suffer. Let me just pick a few because of time.
As you make it very brief, because we need to pick a lot of thoughts before we, yes, go ahead.
Okay, now we are looking at education, the F-Cube, free SHS. Personally, I don't think that we've done well. Housing, Saglemi is there, it's gone waste. Energy, okay, we are looking at how we can revamp that sector, and the Galamsey activities, water resources, the pollution. So you see, all that you are saying, I agree with you, but if you're not careful, the next generation wouldn't even be there. And I'm sure by the time we are all dead and gone, Ghana might not even be in existence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see two hands there. From there we come here. Okay, so two hands there. We pick them and then we get Vish to address them. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Apia Kusi Adumakon. I'm the West African Regional Director for CAT. Thank you very much, Vince, for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to say that I have done an extensive review of the PPP Act and the policy. And one of the things that I think that when it is improved, it can enhance the visibility and also the outcome of our PPP vision. I think currently it is housed in a unit at the Ministry of Finance. And I think that if we can evacuate it and set up a PPP secretariat that will be equipped with more experts in that regard, they will be able to identify projects, do a roadshow. I was recently in Singapore and some African countries had itemized some projects and they were doing some roadshow. So we can do better with what we have currently. Number two, the first question I'll talk about education sector. I can also see that government of Ghana has been spending a lot of resources in senior high school, especially when the free SHS came. They had to put up more infrastructure to accommodate more students. And some schools that are in the cities are sitting on big prime lands that are not being used, and those lands are being fenced. And one way that government can do is that we can identify some strategic areas. Let's say, for example, PRESEC or even University of Ghana has got a huge tract of land. We can decide to get a PPP to come and develop some of them into, let's say, commercial infrastructure, high-class residential areas, and then part of the money can be used by the universities to also develop its academic and its infrastructure needs. So in this way, there will be a win-win for both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Winston. My name is Kofi Yesu.
Okay.
Assistant Headmaster of Accra Academy. No wonder everybody is talking about education. First of all, let me commend the speaker for telling us what he has given us this morning, and the two ladies who also came in to explain one or two things to us. We can see that financing education has now become a challenge to our nation, and we can all attest to the fact that the free SHS is a good thing, but so many things we were not able to do it in a positive direction. As somebody put it, the accommodation and things like that, where students will lodge. And now we have a lot of uncompleted buildings in our schools. Talking about the PPP, is there any possible means that we can get other people to come to the school and then support us if the government cannot go the way that we want to see it, so that we can see our schools moving on in the right direction? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll get Vish to address the first three questions, then we'll come around again for the next set of questions.
Thank you, Winston, and thank you for those questions and remarks. So I'll start with my colleague from PKF and the concern that he expressed about, if I understood the question correctly, essentially you're concerned that we may end up loading the government with further debt, which future generations will be saddled with. But you see, this is actually one of the key considerations that one must look at when designing a PPP project. Because in essence, a PPP project should not leave the government with debt that it cannot sustain, right? So sustainable financing is one of the aspects of a PPP. So typically, if you put together a PPP project that is financed by the private sector, the debt would not be on government's books. Typically, the project company is the one that will assume the debt, and that debt is then paid for by proceeds. If it's a user paying a project, then proceeds that come in from the users. So for example, if the, let's take a simple example of a road again. If it's a PPP project, then in principle, the tolls should be sufficient to cover the debt and to pay the expenses, etc., if it is well designed, so that it's sustainable, so that it doesn't become an obligation on government. There are some instances where the project cannot be self-financing and government has to put in some money. In that case, what has to happen is that the obligations on government have to be properly quantified, so that government knows that it has to put in, let's say, 100 million per annum, no more than that. And then it's budgeted for year on year, so that government can comfortably factor that into its projections and ensure that we don't have debt accumulation arising from these projects. So the fear is real, and I understand what you're saying, but it's something that is critical to the proper design of a PPP. And where PPP projects run into trouble, where debt sustainability becomes an issue, then the PPP has to be restructured. It's as I said in the presentation, it's similar to any other contract, as sometimes you may have to go in and restructure it. But you do not start off with the objective of putting debt on government's books. And if government has to provide some financing, it must be properly quantified and contained so that you don't end up creating the problem that you've referred to. The next question was about the PPP being housed in the Ministry of Finance. So yes, I know that in some countries they have separate PPP authorities that are institutions on their own. Maybe the team from Ministry of Finance can comment better, but from our perspective, in our PPP journey as a country, I think that perhaps we need to get a few more experiences under our belt before we can set up a fully independent PPP authority. So the point is well made, and I understand exactly what you're saying, because if it's set up independently and is able to run at arm's length from central government, serving the interest of all parties, that is the ultimate. And that exists in some countries, but in Ghana we're not there yet, and I think it's something that we can aspire to in due course. Then the final point was about education, and education. From what I took from the question, it seems like the question is leaning towards education infrastructure. So using PPPs to provide hostels or accommodation facilities, or maybe even classrooms or such like. And all of those things are possible. It can be done, it has been done. Yes, I know in Ghana we have a situation where I think the University of Ghana ran into some trouble with some hostel project. Yes, but the principle is there and it can work. The challenge with social projects of this nature is that from a commercial point of view, they may not necessarily pay for themselves. But that is where the structuring and the risk allocation between the public authority and the government, and the private sector comes to play. So again, the public authority may dedicate some budgetary allocation to bridge the gap between what is affordable for the occupants if it's a hostel and what the private sector needs to cover its costs. So all of this is possible. I think it's a journey that we're on, and the assessment has to be done thoroughly, but PPPs can work in pretty much any sector. It's just that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and you need to study it carefully. So, Winston.
Thank you very much, Vish. Okay, so we'll pick the next set of questions. I see the lady here, the hand. Yes, we need to get the lady here to also ask a question. Her hand has been out for a very long time. So, as and when you caught my eye, I come to you, yes. Don't worry, everybody will have a chance.
Thank you very much. My name is Mercy Avogo. I work with the Nursing and Midwifery Council. So during your presentation, you stated that PPP is not always financing. And I believe putting in the right framework in Ghana is also a factor. You also stated that a key factor to successful PPP delivery is speedy delivery of the project. With your experience in Ghana, knowing where we came from and where we are now, with our current legislative framework, the Act 1039 particularly, do you find the Act very enabling to drive the PPP agenda in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Philip Latte. I used to work in a public authority, but now I work at the other side as a private consultant. So I have two contributions mainly. The first one has to do with government's attention when it comes to PPPs. So many government functionaries, when they tend to hype up PPPs as a panacea to solve all our problems. But as soon as they hit reality, then they realize that probably PPPs might not even be possible within their period of their term. And then they tend quickly to move to EPC contracts and start to load government's books with debt. So it's important that government, or the public party, for that matter, understands that PPPs, especially during the design period, takes time in terms of the preparation. Typically, we are talking of PPPs which will last about 20 years, and as we said, at least a generation. So PPPs, in this part, will last probably up to 2 to 3 years in terms of planning, for going through all the cycle of doing the feasibility, getting the various approvals and things. And sometimes it doesn't become too attractive for governments to go into PPPs, and they tend sometimes to frustrate their efforts, because they would say, okay, let me go to what I am typically comfortable with. Then the second comment I want to make happens to do with PPPs in terms of being done at the assembly level, and some of my previous speakers have spoken about that. When we talk about PPPs in fora like this, it tends to be on a national scale. But it's important for us to realize that PPPs also can really thrive very well at the district and the assembly levels. And sometimes, because of the seeming bureaucracy at national level, some of the proponents tend to want to start to work with the assemblies, because unfortunately they don't have the critical and analytical skills there to give your feasibility some kick. So I think we need to look at the opportunities there: markets, hostels, transport terminals, hospital facilities. They are all there, and I have had the opportunity to work with a couple of proponents who try to avoid going to the national, that have been up to Ministry of Finance, and think that they would prefer to work at assembly levels. But sometimes you are not going to get the best value for money, and I think they need to improve their capacity at that sector. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Philip, let's see. Okay.
All right, thank you. Inus Ashraz, Minister of Education. And I wish to congratulate Vish. You've been around for a while. A couple of two quick questions. Number one, I think Philip touched on it, and it's about the appetite of political leadership. I sit before ministers to advise them on financing options for projects. PPPs, very good, as you have presented. But in many instances, this political leadership is concerned about the duration or the time period required in structuring PPP. What has been your experience, and how will you be able to advise in this? And the second one is just to make a kind of a quick response to my colleague from Accra. Senior, we have a vibrant public investment unit in Ministry of Education, established in line with the public investment regulation. So if you have any concerns, please link up so that we can have a discussion and see how we are able to put together a project paper and then engage with our colleagues at Ministry of Finance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I see. Okay, so let's get to, yes, 1, 2.
My name is Ebenezer Afenyidazi, editor Manjo Online. I enjoyed the presentation a lot. For me as a journalist, I've had the thinking always that PPP covers even government just singling out people, sole sourcing and giving them contracts, and then maybe provides all the money. But like you said, there's a clear distinction between what that and the other is. I think that sometimes maybe in the conversation we are leaving out the elephant in the room, because from where I sit, I have this mindset, I could be wrong, that sometimes the PPP arrangements probably have very sophisticated monitoring and fiscal discipline systems that probably may not allow crook politicians who may want to benefit from kickbacks and what have you. But probably the other way around is easier. You know, the ones where we call you, sole sourcing, we give you, and all those ones. Maybe those ones become easier for people to get some benefits on the side. And so sometimes PPP may not be an option. And like my brother said, the politician is also looking at short-term gains because of the political benefit. And PPPs usually are long-term projects. And so sometimes there may be a dislike towards that. But I also want to get something. Is it really from you? Is it a case of limited capacity of private sector players in our country? Because our economy is generally small if you compare to many others. Or it's an issue of the lack of political will because of sometimes certain benefits that a PPP properly so-called will not allow certain loopholes for those leakages into people's private pockets, and so it becomes a challenge. Also, I want to make a quick comment. Madam from Finance Ministry made a comment that people are happy that Towboat is coming back. I don't believe so. I don't know on what basis she made that claim. Because when the announcement was made, even by the recent road minister nominee, the comment I have gleaned generally from social media is that for those who want it back, they want it back in an efficient format and a digitalized format where I don't have to be in a queue for so long before I pay. And also in a digitalized format that allows proper accountability of the monies that are going to be collected, that they will go into the right places of the road fund to solve the problems of the roads. So it's not a general reaction that people are excited that it's coming back. We want a properly modernized system that ensures that the monies are being taken to the right places. Because don't forget, there was a social component in the former system, which is that it was employing disabled persons. So there was a social component. So we don't know how the monies were being utilized and all that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ebenezer. Okay, last question for now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Edmond Awaiti. I own a book business, Value Added Book Services. Mr. Ashongo, excellent presentation. Based on your experience, has a service level agreement between private sector and the public sector be effective? In what way can that be effectively implemented so that we have effective and efficient projects? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. We'll get Vish. Okay, last question you say? Okay.
My name is Enoch Nsuamensa from Aries Properties, Ghana Limited. Vish, thanks for the presentation that you made. I think that PPPs are an excellent forum for raising financing, and it's something that we've been looking out for quite a very long time. For 8 years, for instance, we were sitting on $650 million to invest in Ghana. We could only disburse $70 million. The challenge is that projects like Vish mentioned is not able to guarantee cash flow. And so if your project is not able to guarantee the cash flow to make it viable, it becomes a major challenge. The very simple thing that could be done is take off taxes, and that alone is 21% of the project cost. Politicians are unwilling to take it, even though it serves the social good. And so sometimes you wonder what the Ministry of Finance will be looking at if at the end of the day, a 21% added on to a project cost does not make it viable. That's the reason why you find hostels not attractive in the bigger scale, because the kind of policy that you require to regulate rentals does not make it a viable option. And I think it is up to us as a government or a nation to take a second look at it. The other thing is also that there is a wrong perception of PPPs. Wrong perception in the sense that politicians or people in offices sometimes think of it as a loan. And so they look at it as going to the bank and then taking a project finance, 2%, 10%, and that basically is it. For anybody who is looking at a long-term investment, he's looking something way beyond that kind of rate because he has another kind of option for the investment that he has. And finally, what I would like to say is that government itself shoots itself in the foot because sometimes they compete. Government competes with itself with some projects that they could literally have rolled it out as PPPs, but find it so attractive that they would want to do an EPC and then leave out the ones which are literally booming for the private sector to go and invest in. And so it doesn't make it very attractive for people to go into such PPPs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll get Vish to address, hold on 1 minute, we'll get Vish to address all these questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Pamela DeBort. I'm a partner at EY. Hello,
Sure.
Vish. Good presentation. Very quick question. I hear you mention the fact that a lot of the information you supplied us today comes from the public domain. But how do people get information on what PPPs government is up for grabs? Where is the information? How do people get to know that the accessibility of information becomes very important here? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Vish?
Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. Try and touch on each of them in order which they were. So I think the lady who asked the first question was asking about the Act and whether it was sufficient in terms of enabling PPPs in Ghana. And I would have to say yes. The Act is pretty elaborate, and it talks about so many things. I know it took a number of years to put together, and the short answer to your question is yes. It considers a number of different things, but again, like any other law, I guess that as we progress, we may come back and fine-tune certain aspects of it. But as we sit today, it makes provision for essentially all the things we've spoken about, the risk allocation, any support that government has to put in, the procurement process, which I think one gentleman asked about. It's pretty elaborate. So I think that it is fit for purpose. But again, because it's quite elaborate, that's some of the things that we need to get used to as private sector business people. Sometimes we just need to take our time and work through things. And the idea is to safeguard the interests of the state. And that's why it's as elaborate as it is. And I think it does work. So hopefully that's a good enough answer for that. Then somebody asked about the time it takes, I think, if I got the question right.
Yeah.
And the fact that it doesn't fit into the political cycle and was asking about our experience. I mean, the fact is yes. PPPs take time to put together. But remember, what we're talking about here is sustainable development. So if you want to put a project in place that is going to continue to deliver benefits for generations, you cannot do it overnight. It takes time. Yes, we have had experiences where government officials or specifically politicians want a project concluded within a certain 4-year term. It probably has not been possible, but the good part of it is that this notwithstanding, the work has continued, right? The work has continued. So any government, in my experience, that comes in typically picks up the project from where it was left off. They may push it along a little bit further. They may not conclude it, but I believe that over time we'll get there. Perhaps we'll get there a bit later than we ordinarily would have done because of the time frames. But yes, it's an issue. We must acknowledge that. But I think as understanding, and if I can use the word focus, if we focus on what is sustainable development, if we can focus on that extensively, then PPPs will actually work in our environment. Somebody asked about, or made a point about, I think it was a gentleman from Joy who was referring to corruption, I'm paraphrasing, corruption, and maybe that's why people don't want to do PPPs. Well, I think corruption is possible in any type of contract, but the thing about the PPP Act is that it is pretty rigorous in terms of how you must go about identifying, selecting, and contracting. So I don't think you're even allowed to sole source under the PPP Act. You must go through a bid process, and you must go through certain approval stages. So these are some of the things that lengthens the timeline, but ultimately, again, the idea is to safeguard the public interest. So it goes through a number of review stages and is subject to a certain amount of rigor. That will not eliminate the corruption, but I think there are safeguards in place, not just for corruption, but value for money, and I think, as Cynthia said, essentially value for people. To Enoch's point about projects not guaranteeing, there was a question about SLAs as to whether, in our experience, SLAs have been effective. I think the answer is simply that it's been mixed, right? Private sector is quite used to working with SLAs. But the thing with SLAs is this: once you define a performance indicator, you must have essentially about 3 key things. You must have the baseline. So where are you starting from? If you say to somebody, I want you to move me from 0 to 100, and I'll pay you based on your progress in getting me there, then you must know that you actually started from 0. Because if indeed you were starting from 95, and then the other partner comes back and tells you, oh, by the way, we've reached 100, so you owe me this remuneration, then you'd be shortchanging yourself. So you must have the baseline, and then the definition of those KPIs must be clear. A lot of the time when SLAs run into trouble, it's because there's debate as to what was meant. What was actually the performance indicator that we were measuring? How was it to be measured? Who was to measure it? And is it done or it's not done? So clarity is essential. But private sector is pretty used to KPIs. And I think in some of the PPPs that have run into trouble, KPIs have become a debate because one person understood it one way, another person understood it a different way, and maybe the baseline was not even clear. But they can work, but they just need to be clearly defined and established. Then there was a question about not guaranteeing, the projects are not guaranteeing cash flows. And if I understood the question clearly, what you're suggesting is that because for public services, there tends to be a cap on how much you can charge, right? So that also affects the financials of the project. That's a debate with the public authority. And the public authority, and I think the PPP Act requires this, the public authority thinks more broadly than just the numbers from a financial perspective. They are thinking about economic benefits and such like, but they all need to be quantified. So I think that projects can be made viable or bankable with some level of government support, with some level of government accommodation, provided it is clear that there are wider benefits that the project brings to bear. And in that case, I think it's possible. It's not easy, and I acknowledge that it's not easy, but in our environment where we're grappling with affordability issues and trying to manage government's fiscal position, I think that's where the challenges come. So it makes it more difficult, but it is possible. It's a matter of negotiation and engagement. So Pamela's question about accessibility of data, I think if you went to the Ministry of Finance, the Public Investment Department, I hope that's what you're still called. So, yeah, you can get all the information you need. I think at a point it was actually published. I'm not sure whether it still is, but that information is publicly available. Projects that are either in preparation or projects that are ready to go, that's all publicly available information that you can get from the Ministry of Finance, from Cynthia's team. Yeah.
Okay, I think, Cynthia, you want to make a quick point, because our time is up. We need to be wrapping up. We'll be taking off air shortly, so just make it very brief for me.
All right, thank you very much. In terms of information, if you go to the Ministry of Finance website, We have the annual PPP reports that we publish. I have 10 copies here for those who are interested. But online, you would find this publication on the ministry's website. And quickly, just to add a few comments, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that now.
In 30 seconds.
The ministry, in terms of its commitment to PPPs, we also have the viability gap scheme, where government feels strongly that a PPP project will be viable with its commitment. We are willing to provide some support in terms of the capex, or also in terms of the revenue shortfall.
Okay.
It all depends on the project that we are seeking to advance. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And on that note, brings us to the end of the first quarter edition of the Graphic Business Stanbic Bank Breakfast Meeting. We're now crossing over to Parliament, where Minister for Defense Designate, Dr. Edward Kofi Omanebwama, has been vetted. My name is Winston, and when you're live on the Joy News channel and Joy 99.7 FM, do have a lovely day.